The tears on her face looked like the rain was crying with her. And Ryeo Man-Young didn't stop for anyone. Not for cops, not for rivals, and sure as hell, not for strangers sobbing on a filthy curb at midnight. But his black Mercedes rolled to a halt anyway. 3 SUVs behind him stopped cold. 4 of his men reached for their weapons, scanning the neon-soaked street for a threat. There was no threat. Just a girl, a beautiful black woman with a crown of dark, rain-drenched curls clinging to her face, drowning inside an oversized cream sweater that made her look like she was trying to disappear. Her hands were pressed to her chest like she was holding her own heart together, sitting on wet concrete, shivering, broken, with mascara rivers carving lines down her cheeks. Beside her on the curb, a garbage bag slumped open, clothes spilling out, a framed photograph face down in a puddle, the gutted remains of a life someone had thrown away like trash. Ryeo stepped out of the car. No umbrella at first. Just him 6 feet of tailored black suit, dark ink crawling up his neck and across the knuckles of his right hand, rain hammering his shoulders like it didn't dare touch his face. His expression was carved from stone, cold, unreadable, the kind of face that made grown men cross the street. His lieutenant, Doc-soo, hissed from the open car door. "Boss, what are you doing?" Ryeo didn't answer. He walked to the trunk, pulled out a black umbrella, opened it with one sharp snap that echoed off the alley walls like a gunshot. Then he stood over her. Not beside her, over her, shielding her. The umbrella tilted so every drop of rain hit his left shoulder instead of her hair. His tattooed hand gripped the handle inches above her head, and for the first time in a decade, the most dangerous man in the district looked down at someone not to intimidate them but to protect them. She looked up, and the whole neighborhood went silent. Shop owners froze behind wet glass. Street vendors stopped mid-sentence. Even the stray cats scattered. Because everyone on that block knew the rules when Ryeo Man-Young's convoy rolled through. You looked away. You didn't watch. You didn't breathe too loud. But tonight, they couldn't look away. Because the monster was being gentle. And that was more terrifying than anything he'd ever done. Her name was Jane Foster. She didn't know that the man shielding her from the storm ran every shadow operation from the docks to the city center. She didn't know that the tattoos on his hand each represented a debt someone paid in blood. All she knew was that 30 minutes ago, 3 men in cheap suits had thrown her belongings into the gutter, changed the locks on her apartment, and told her if she called the police, she'd disappear. All she knew was that the rain was freezing and her chest wouldn't stop hurting, and no one, not a single person, had stopped. Until him. "Who did this to you?" His voice was low, not soft, low like thunder deciding whether to strike. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out but a choked sob. He didn't ask again, but his eyes moved down to her hands, clasped and trembling, then to the garbage bag beside her, its contents spilling across the wet concrete. Clothes, books, a camera lens cap rolling toward the gutter. The wreckage was obvious. Someone had been thrown out of somewhere, and recently. He simply removed his suit jacket, a jacket worth more than 6 months of her rent, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. Then he turned to Doc-soo, and the warmth vanished from his face like it had never existed. "Find out who owns the building on 4th and Crane. I want a name in 20 minutes. Doc-soo stared. "Boss, she's nobody." Ryo's eyes cut to him like a blade finding bone. 20 minutes. That was the night everything changed. Not just for Jane, who went from sobbing on a curb to sitting in the back of a Mercedes that smelled like leather and danger. Not just for Ryeo, whose iron heart cracked open for the first time since he was 15 and bleeding in the same gutter. But for Marcus Thorne, the corrupt developer who had just made the fatal mistake of destroying a woman that a predator decided to claim as his own. Thorne didn't know it yet, but the umbrella Ryeo held over Jane's head, that was a declaration of war. And Ryeo Man-Young had never lost one. Before we continue this story, and want to see what happens next, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The Mercedes smelled like leather, sandalwood, and something metallic she couldn't name. Jane sat in the back seat, with Ryo's jacket still draped over her shoulders, her wet sweater clinging to her skin like a second layer of grief. She hadn't stopped shaking. Not from the cold anymore, from the shock of being inside a car that cost more than every possession she'd ever owned combined. The seats were heated. She could feel the warmth seeping through the soaked fabric of her sweater, into her bones, and it made her want to cry all over again because she couldn't remember the last time anything had been warm. Ryo sat beside her. Not close, not far. The exact distance a wolf keeps from something it hasn't decided to eat or defend yet. His phone buzzed 7 times during the 12-minute drive. He didn't answer it once. He just watched the rain crawl down the tinted window, his tattooed hand resting on his knee, perfectly still, the kind of still that only men who've committed violence learn to master. Once, at a red light, his eyes shifted to her. She felt it more than saw it, a weight, a calculation, like being measured by something ancient and patient. When she turned to meet his gaze, he was already looking back at the window. The convoy pulled into an underground garage beneath a high-rise that had no name on the building. No signage, no lobby directory, no doorman smiling behind a marble desk. Just raw concrete pillars, halogen lights buzzing overhead, and a steel elevator door that required a thumbprint and a 6-digit code that Doksu punched in while glancing at Jane like she was a ticking device someone had smuggled past security. 42nd floor, Doksu muttered. The safe suite. Ryo shook his head. Penthouse. The silence in that elevator was deafening. Doksu's jaw tightened so hard Jane could hear his teeth click. The other guard, a thick-necked man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and hands the size of dinner plates, shifted his weight and stared at the ceiling like it contained instructions for surviving his bosses. Insanity. Nobody said what they were all thinking. The penthouse was Ryo's personal floor. His war room. His sanctuary. The place where he slept, planned, and occasionally made decisions that rearranged the city's underworld like furniture. In 11 years of running the Syndicate, he had never brought an outsider above the 30th floor, let alone to the top. And now he was bringing a soaking wet stranger in a cream sweater who couldn't stop crying. The elevator opened to a space that made Jane's breath catch despite everything. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, rain streaking down the glass like the skyline was melting. The view was enormous, a sprawling panorama of neon signs, wet rooftops, and headlights crawling through flooded streets 42 stories below. Dark hardwood floors stretched wall to wall. Minimal furniture, everything black, gray, and sharp-edged, as if softness had been deliberately removed from the room. A sectional sofa, the color of charcoal. A low glass coffee table with nothing on it. A long marble kitchen island with nothing on it, except a single crystal tumbler and a bottle of something amber. The whole space felt like the inside of a weapon designed, precise, and stripped of anything unnecessary. Ryeo walked to a hallway closet and returned with a thick charcoal blanket, folded with military precision. He held it out to her without a word. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. Bathroom is the second door on the left, he said, his voice carrying the same low thunder from the street. There are dry clothes in the dresser beside it. They'll be too large. Wear them anyway. Jane opened her mouth to thank him, to question him, to do something other than stand there dripping on a floor that probably cost more per square foot than her entire ruined apartment. A dozen sentences formed and collapsed in her throat. Who are you? Why did you stop? What do you want from me? Am I safe here? Am I safe anywhere? I don't, she started. You don't need to explain anything tonight. He turned away from her and pulled his rain-soaked shirt over his head in one motion, and Jane saw the rest of the ink. It wasn't just his neck and hands. A massive dragon coiled across his entire back, its jaws open over his left shoulder blade. Scales rendered in such brutal detail they looked alive, dark greens and blacks bleeding into crimson along the creature's throat. The tail wrapped around his right side, disappearing beneath the waistline of his trousers. Scars interrupted the artwork in places, a raised white line across his ribs, a starburst of healed tissue near his hip, 3 parallel marks on his lower back, that looked like they'd been made by something sharper than a knife. A map of war written on skin. Every scar a story he didn't tell. Every inch of ink a language she didn't speak. He didn't seem to care that she saw. Or maybe he wanted her to. Maybe he wanted her to understand exactly what kind of man had just taken her off the streets so she could make her decision with open eyes. "Doc Sue," he called without turning around. "Get everyone in the briefing room. Now." The briefing room was one floor below a windowless concrete space lined with monitors showing security feeds from across the city, the air thick with cigarette smoke and cold coffee and the sour undertone of male tension. 6 of Ryo's top lieutenants sat around a steel table, scarred with cigarette burns and knife marks that nobody talked about, none of them happy, all of them armed. Doc Sue stood at the head of the table because Ryeo hadn't arrived yet. He was pacing 5 steps east, 5 steps west, his hands clasped behind his back like a soldier waiting for artillery to land. "He's lost his mind," said Park, the Syndicate's financial officer, a wiry man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked more accountant than criminal, which was exactly why he was dangerous. Park could make $3 million disappear into 17 shell companies across 4 countries before lunch, and he could do it while eating a sandwich. "We don't do charity. We don't do strays. And we damn sure don't bring them to the penthouse. That floor has operational security protocols that took us 2 years to build. One stranger with a cell phone could compromise everything." "She's nobody," added Kwan, who ran the enforcement crews, a broad-shouldered man whose neck was almost as wide as his head. With knuckles that looked like they'd been broken and reset so many times, they'd given up trying to heal straight. His arms were crossed, his expression sour. Some woman crying in the rain. "We passed 100 of them this month. Since when do we stop the whole damn convoy for tears?" "Since the boss says we stop." Doc Sue's voice was tight but loyal. He'd been with Ryeo since they were teenagers, fighting over scraps in Incheon, 2 boys sleeping in shifts under a highway overpass, taking turns keeping watch for the older gangs who thought children made easy prey. Doc Sue had watched Ryeo go from a feral kid with bloody knuckles to the most feared name in the city. Loyalty didn't mean he understood. It meant he obeyed first and questioned in private, always in private. Never in front of the others. That was the code. The door opened. Ryeo walked in wearing a fresh black shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, tattoos on full display like a deliberate reminder of who they were talking to. His hair was still damp, pushed back from his forehead. He didn't sit. He never sat in these meetings. Sitting was for men who felt secure. Ryeo preferred to stand, so everyone in the room had to look up at him. "The building at 4th and Crane," he said, skipping every pleasantry that didn't exist between them anyway. "Who owns it?" Park pulled up a file on his tablet, adjusting his glasses. "Shell Company. Registered offshore through a holding group in the Caymans, but the beneficial owner traces back to Thorne Development Group. Marcus Thorne." Something shifted in Ryo's expression. It was subtle, a micro-tightening around the eyes, a stillness in his jaw that his men had learned to fear more than shouting. Ryeo didn't yell. Ryeo didn't throw things. Ryeo got quiet, and when Ryeo got quiet, people disappeared. "Thorne," he repeated. The name sat in his mouth like something rotten. "He owes us," Park confirmed, scrolling through the file. 312,000. Protection fees, laundering facilitation, and a bridge loan we extended 8 months ago for one of his construction projects. Overdue by 4 months. We've sent 2 collection notices. He's been dodging changed offices twice, cycled through 3 different assistants to screen calls. Ryeo placed both hands flat on the steel table. The dragon's tail inked across his right knuckles looked like it was coiling around the metal, squeezing. "He owes us money, and he's out there illegally evicting tenants from buildings in our territory, operating without authorization, drawing police attention to streets we've spent years keeping clean." His voice was calm, lethally calm, the kind of calm that preceded storms that sank ships. Who authorized him to operate on our streets without clearing it through us? No one answered. The silence was its own confession. Exactly. He straightened up. Nobody. Which means Marcus Thorne isn't just a debtor. He's disrespectful. And we don't tolerate disrespect. Not for 300,000. Not for $3. Not for a single one. Quan leaned forward, his massive forearms on the table. So this is about territory? Not the girl? Ryeo looked at him for 3 full seconds, the kind of look that made Quan's hand instinctively drift toward his sidearm even though the threat was coming from his own boss. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much. But when Ryeo Man-Young is staring at you without blinking, 3 seconds feels like 3 hours in a windowless room with no exit. It's about whatever I say it's about. That ended the discussion. Upstairs, Jane stood in the bathroom wearing a black t-shirt that fell to her mid-thigh and a pair of drawstring pants she'd rolled 3 times at the waist. The shirt smelled like sandalwood and something clean, like cold air after a storm. Her reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Puffy eyes rimmed red, swollen lips from crying, her curls wild and half-dried in every direction like they were trying to escape her head. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and exhaled until her lungs were empty. Then she inhaled and tried to find the woman she'd been 6 hours ago. She couldn't. 6 hours ago she'd had an apartment. Small. Yes. The radiator clanked like a ghost with a grudge, and the hot water took 11 minutes to arrive, but it was hers. She'd had a job interview scheduled for Thursday at a gallery downtown assistant curator, her dream since art school. She'd had a laptop with 3 years of freelance photography work, her entire portfolio, her financial records, her half-finished applications for grants she'd never get now. She'd had a shelf of books organized by color because it made her happy. A plant named Gerald that she'd kept alive for 2 years, which felt like an accomplishment. A life. Small and imperfect, and entirely hers. Then the men came. 3 of them, with a forged eviction notice printed on official-looking paper and a locksmith who wouldn't meet her eyes. They gave her 9 minutes to leave. 9. She'd timed it on her phone because she thought the recording might matter later, might be evidence, might mean something in a system that was supposed to protect people like her. When she argued, when she held up her lease and pointed at the date and said this is illegal, "You can't do this." One of them grabbed her arm hard enough to leave fingerprints bruised into her skin and told her that Marcus Thorne doesn't ask twice. The locksmith changed the deadbolt while she stood in the hallway holding nothing but her phone and her sweater, watching her entire life get sealed behind a door that used to be hers. She'd called the police. They took a report, told her to contact a lawyer. She didn't have a lawyer. She'd called her landlord, the old one, before Thorne bought the building. Disconnected number. She'd called her mother in Atlanta, but the call went to voicemail because it was midnight on the East Coast, and her mother slept with her phone on silent and a white noise machine that sounded like ocean waves. So she sat on the curb, and she cried. Not delicately, not cinematically. She cried the way you cry when the world has reached inside your chest and pulled out the last thread holding you together ugly, heaving, snot on your sleeve crying that made her ribs ache and her vision blur until the neon signs melted into watercolors. And then a man with a dragon on his back and murder in his eyes had shielded her from the rain like she mattered. Like she was worth stopping a 3-car convoy in the middle of a monsoon for. Like she was worth ruining a $10,000 suit for. She didn't understand it. She wasn't sure she ever would. She found Ryeo in the kitchen afterward, standing at the marble island, pouring 2 glasses of water, not the amber liquor. Water. He slid one across the counter to her without looking up, as if he'd heard her footsteps from the hallway and already calculated the trajectory of her approach. "Sit," he said. "Not a command. An offer." The difference was in the slight softening at the end of the word, a gentleness so faint that if she hadn't been listening for it, she would have missed it entirely. She sat on one of the tall bar stools and wrapped both hands around the glass like it was warm, even though it wasn't. The penthouse was silent except for the rain against the windows and the distant hum of a city that never fully slept. "The men who took your apartment," Ryeo said, his eyes finally meeting hers. Dark eyes. So dark they were almost black, with a sharpness behind them that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So she did. She told him about the apartment she'd rented for 2 years on the corner of 4th and Crane, 3rd floor, east-facing windows that caught the morning light in a way that made her photography sing. About Marcus Thorne buying the building 6 months ago through a company none of the tenants had ever heard of, and immediately tripling the rent for every unit. About the families who left one by one the old woman on the 3rd floor, who'd lived there for 20 years and wept as her grandson carried boxes to a borrowed van. The couple with the newborn on 5, who couldn't afford formula and rent in the same month. The college student in the basement unit who cried while packing and left a note on the bulletin board that said, "I'm sorry I couldn't stay. Good luck to whoever's left." Jane had stayed because she had a lease. A legal, binding, notarized lease that didn't expire for another 14 months. She'd believed in the system. She'd believed that a piece of paper with signatures on it meant something, that the law was a wall between her and men like Thorne. She'd been wrong. She told Ryeo about the threatening letters, vague enough to avoid legal consequences, specific enough to make her check the locks twice before bed. The inspectors who showed up unannounced and cited code violations that didn't exist, a cracked tile she'd never seen, a fire hazard in a closet she'd never opened. The water that mysteriously stopped working for 6 days during the coldest week of winter, forcing her to shower at a gym 3 blocks away and boil bottled water for coffee. The dead rat someone placed, not found on her doorstep with no note because the message didn't need words. And finally, tonight, the 3 men, the fake eviction order, the locksmith, the 9 minutes, and the hand on her arm that she could still feel like a phantom grip even now, hours later, sitting in a penthouse that existed in a different universe than the one she'd been living in. "They took everything," she said, her voice cracking like thin ice. "My clothes, my camera equipment, 2 lenses that took me a year to save for. But the worst part, my laptop. I had photos on it. Evidence." Ryo's eyes sharpened. The shift was immediate, like watching a blade rotate from flat to edge. Evidence of what? Jane hesitated. She looked at this man, this stranger covered in criminal ink, sitting in a penthouse that screamed organized crime, surrounded by armed men who called him boss without irony, and made a calculation that should have terrified her. She was about to hand sensitive information to a man who was, by every measurable standard, a criminal, a dangerous one, the kind her mother would have crossed 3 streets to avoid. But Marcus Thorne was also a criminal. And Thorne had taken everything from her. The system hadn't saved her. The police hadn't saved her. The lease hadn't saved her. Maybe a monster could. "I'm a photographer," she said. "Freelance. Mostly editorial work magazines, small publications, the occasional corporate gig when I needed the money, which was always. 3 months ago, Thorne's company hired me to shoot promotional images of a development site in the industrial district. Glossy stuff for investors' renderings overlaid on vacant lots, that kind of thing. While I was there, on the 2nd day of the shoot, I wandered past the perimeter looking for a better angle of the waterfront, and I saw trucks, behind the lot, near the river, dumping something. Barrels, dozens of them. Industrial drums with hazard labels I couldn't read from that distance, but the smell was... She stopped, swallowed. Her throat was dry despite the water. Chemical. Bitter. Like burning plastic mixed with something alive and rotting. I took pictures. Hundreds of them. Close-ups of the barrels, the license plates on the trucks, the workers' faces, the hazard labels, the runoff seeping into the river. I kept them on my laptop because I didn't know what to do with them yet. I was still figuring out who to report it to. And Thorne found out. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. He must have. Because 2 weeks after I turned in the promotional photos, the harassment started. And tonight. Her voice broke again, and she hated it, hated the weakness in her own throat. He didn't just want me gone from the building. He wanted that laptop. He wanted those photos destroyed. He wanted me erased. Ryeo was quiet for a long time. The rain hammered the penthouse windows with the relentless patience of something that would outlast them all. The city glowed below them like a circuit board, indifferent to everything happening. 42 stories above it, indifferent to the woman whose life had been dismantled, and the man who was quietly deciding to rebuild it with blood-stained hands. "Your lease," he finally said. "Do you have a copy?" "Digital. In my email." "In my. Forward it to this address." He slid a card across the counter, matte black, no name, no logo, nothing on it but a single, secure email address printed in silver ink. And the name of every man who touched you tonight. Every detail you remember. Faces, voices, scars, tattoos, what they wore, what they drove, what they said word for word. Jane stared at the card. Then she stared at him. "Why are you doing this? And don't say, 'because someone should.' I need a real answer." He picked up his glass, drank, set it down. The crystal caught the city lights and scattered them across the marble like broken stars. "When I was 15, he said, and his voice changed, dropped lower, shed its edge, became something almost human. I slept on the streets of Incheon. No parents, no money, no name anyone cared about. One night, it rained like this. I found a doorway to sleep in, and a man came and kicked me out of it. Not because he needed the space, because he could." He paused. Nobody stopped him. Nobody stopped for me. I remember what that feels like, the rain, the concrete, and the understanding that the world has decided you don't matter. He looked at her, and for the first time, the ice in his expression thawed enough to reveal what was underneath. Not warmth, exactly. Something older. Something that had survived warmth's absence and come out the other side, scarred but unbroken. "I stopped for you," he said, "because I remember what it costs when nobody does." Jane didn't cry. She was too tired for tears. She just nodded, and something unspoken passed between them. An agreement written in silence, sealed by rain, witnessed by a city that didn't care. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the ground trust grows from. 48 hours later, Ryeo unleashed his syndicate on Marcus Thorne's world. It started quietly, at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, because Ryeo believed in the psychological warfare of choosing mundane days for extraordinary violence. 4 of his men walked into the lobby of Thorne Development Group, wearing maintenance uniforms and carrying toolboxes that didn't contain tools. They contained zip ties, a compact crowbar, a signal jammer, and Kwan's personal favorite, a pair of pliers he'd named the Negotiators. They bypassed the front desk by flashing forged work orders printed on Thorne's own company letterhead, a detail Park had arranged overnight, because Park didn't sleep when the boss was angry. They took the service elevator to the 7th floor, where Thorne's private office sat behind frosted glass doors etched with the company logo, and let themselves in with the quiet confidence of men who had done this so many times it felt like clocking in for a shift. Thorne wasn't there. His assistant was a nervous man in a blue tie and an ill-fitting suit who was eating a croissant at his desk and scrolling through his phone when the door opened. He looked up, saw 4 men who did not look like maintenance workers despite the uniforms, and made the critical mistake of reaching for the desk phone. Kwan crossed the room in 2 strides and pinned the man's hand to the desk with a grip that left crescent-shaped nail marks in his skin, and smiled like a man who genuinely, deeply, almost spiritually enjoyed his work. "We're here for the girls' belongings," Kwan said, leaning close enough that the assistant could smell the peppermint gum he was chewing. "Laptop, camera, clothes. Everything your boss took from the apartment at 4th and Crane 3 nights ago. You have 10 minutes to produce it, or we start looking ourselves." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "And we are not gentle searchers." The assistant stammered something about not knowing what they were talking about. His eyes darted to the frosted doors like salvation might walk through them. It didn't. Kwan picked up a crystal paperweight from the desk, a heavy, expensive thing engraved with the Thorne Development logo, studied it with genuine admiration, turning it in the light like a jeweler appraising a diamond, and then hurled it through the floor-to-ceiling window behind Thorne's empty chair. The glass didn't crack. It exploded a detonation of shards that rained 40 feet down onto the manicured courtyard below, glittering in the morning sun like a chandelier someone had dropped from heaven. 9 minutes, Kwan said pleasantly. Then he sat down in Thorne's leather chair, leaned back, and folded his hands behind his head like a man settling in for a long, comfortable wait. They got the laptop in 4 minutes. The camera equipment, 2 lenses, a camera body, and a tripod in 6. Jane's personal belongings, clothes, books, a framed photograph of her mother, a small potted plant that had somehow survived the eviction in its ceramic pot, all stuffed carelessly into garbage bags like they were trash waiting for a curb in 8. Quan inspected the laptop, confirmed the serial number matched the one Jane had provided, and nodded. Before leaving, he placed a handwritten note on Thorne's desk, weighted down with a spent bullet casing he carried for exactly these occasions. The note was written in Korean, in Ryo's own hand. Translated, it read, "You owe us 312,000. The interest just went up. R." It was the first shot fired in a war that Marcus Thorne didn't know he'd already lost. But Thorne didn't see it that way. He fired back within 24 hours. 2 of Ryo's collection crews were ambushed at separate locations across the city, one at a warehouse on the east side where a shipment of electronics was being redistributed, another at a restaurant that served excellent bulgogi to the public and served as a front for laundering to the private. The attacks were coordinated, professional, the kind of hit that required surveillance, planning, and funding that a real estate developer shouldn't have had access to. No casualties, Ryo's men were too well trained for that, but 3 were hospitalized with injuries ranging from broken ribs to a collapsed lung, and the message was unmistakable. Thorne had muscle. Real muscle. And he wasn't afraid to use it. Ryo received the news at 3 a.m. He was standing at the penthouse window, watching the city like a general surveying a battlefield after the first exchange of cannon fire. His reflection in the glass was ghostly translucent, overlaid on the glittering sprawl below, as if he existed in 2 worlds simultaneously and belonged fully to neither. Behind him, Jane slept on the sectional sofa, the charcoal blanket pulled up to her chin. She'd refused the guest bedroom 3 nights in a row, said the open space made her feel safer, said she could see the doors from the sofa. He hadn't argued. He understood the architecture of fear, how it rearranges your relationship with walls and exits and the distance between your body and the nearest way out. He looked at her reflection in the glass, curled up, small, still wearing his oversized clothes that made her look like a child playing dress-up in a world she didn't belong in. Her curls were a dark halo against the gray cushion. Her face was peaceful for the first time since he'd found her, smooth, unguarded, her lips slightly parted. No tears, no trembling. Just the deep, unguarded rest of someone who had decided, consciously or not, that the walls around her were strong enough to hold. Something in his chest tightened, a muscle he'd forgotten he had, a feeling he didn't have a name for because he'd spent 2 decades killing every feeling that made him vulnerable. He turned away. Vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Not with a war starting. Double the security on every asset, he told Doc-Soo over the phone, his voice barely above a whisper so he wouldn't wake her. Every warehouse, every front, every collection point. And get me everything on Thorne's operation. Every contract, every partner, every property, every permit. I want to know what this man eats for breakfast. I want to know the name of his dentist. I want to know if he sleeps with the window open. A pause on the other end. And Doc-Soo? Find out where he's getting his soldiers. A real estate developer doesn't ambush Syndicate crews with that kind of coordination. Someone's backing him. I want to know who. The next morning, Ryo left for the east side to assess the damage from Thorne's retaliation and visit his injured men in the hospital because Ryo always visited, always personally, which was one of the reasons his men would walk into fire for him. Jane woke to an empty penthouse and the strange silence of being alone in a palace that belonged to a criminal. The rain had finally stopped. Thin morning light pushed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the city below from a dark sprawl into something almost beautiful steam, rising from wet rooftops. Sunlight catching puddles in the streets, the world washed clean. She didn't snoop. At first, she made coffee using a machine that looked like it required an engineering degree and a security clearance, pressing buttons in combinations that produced espresso, then something frothy. Then, a noise that sounded like a small engine failing before finally delivering a cup of coffee that was, admittedly, the best she'd ever tasted. She found bread in a freezer that contained exactly 4 items: bread, ice, frozen dumplings, and a single container of something labeled in Korean that she was too afraid to open, and sat at the kitchen island eating toast while the city dried itself outside. On the counter beside her, the small potted plant Gerald sat in its cracked ceramic pot, the one surviving piece of her old life that had made it through the eviction intact. She'd nearly cried when Kwan's men returned it with her belongings. She watered it with 2 tablespoons from her coffee cup and set it in a patch of morning light near the window, because some things deserve to keep living even when the world around them falls apart. Then she noticed the door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open. Not much. Maybe 2 inches. Just enough to suggest that someone had left in a hurry and hadn't pulled it shut completely. She told herself not to go. Told herself that snooping through a crime boss's private rooms was the kind of decision that appeared in the first act of movies, where the curious character doesn't survive the third. Told herself to sit down, eat her toast, and wait for Ryeo to come back like a reasonable person who valued her continued existence. She went anyway, because Jane Foster had always been more curious than careful, and recent events hadn't cured her of that. It was an office, Spartan, like the rest of the penthouse, but the walls told a different story than the minimalist aesthetic suggested. A massive corkboard hung behind a dark wood desk, floor to nearly ceiling, covered in photographs, maps, printed documents, and red string connecting locations across the city like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except this wasn't theory, this was operations. She recognized some of the areas, the docks, the industrial district where she'd photographed the barrels, the row of shops near her old apartment, the restaurant that had been ambushed. Each location was annotated in Korean with dates, names, and numbers. On the desk, a stack of manila folders, each labeled with a name she didn't recognize. Financial documents covered in columns of figures that meant nothing to her individually but collectively painted a picture of staggering scale. Shipping manifests. A leather-bound ledger filled with handwritten numbers in neat rows, deposits, withdrawals, transfers that made her stomach drop. Not because of the amounts, though the amounts were enough to make her dizzy, but because of what they implied. This wasn't a man who ran a corner operation. This wasn't a local tough with a few businesses and a crew. This was infrastructure, an empire built on shadow economics and enforced loyalty, stretching across the city like an invisible second government. She should have been terrified. She was terrified. Her hand trembled as she turned the pages, and she kept glancing at the door like Ryeo might materialize there and find her elbow deep in his secrets. But then she noticed the second corkboard. It was smaller, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, tucked in the corner near the window where the morning light was strongest. This one had different photos, not operations, not targets, not maps of criminal enterprise. A community center with a fresh coat of bright yellow paint and a hand-lettered sign reading, "Free after-school tutoring, all ages welcome." A grocery store in the old neighborhood with a handwritten note pinned beneath its photo. Rent-waived family of 4, mother recovering from surgery, indefinite. A stack of receipts from a medical supply company clipped to a note. Monthly delivery to Mrs. Kim oxygen tanks, medication do not send invoice. An envelope of cash-thick, rubber-banded clipped to a photo of an elderly woman standing in a small apartment, smiling at something off-camera. Jane's breath stopped. She recognized that woman. It was Mrs. Cho, the old woman from the 3rd floor of Jane's building, the one who'd lived there for 20 years, the one who'd wept as her grandson carried boxes to a borrowed van the day Thorne's eviction notices cleared the building. Attached to the envelope was a note in the same meticulous handwriting as the criminal ledgers. Monthly. Don't let her know where it comes from. If she asks, say it's from a church fund. Jane stepped back from the desk and pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes burned. He was a monster. That part was undeniable. The ledgers, the maps, the red string connecting crimes like constellations. This was a man who operated outside every law she'd ever been taught to respect. He ran an empire of fear and violence. People obeyed him because the alternative was unthinkable. His hands were tattooed with ink that told stories of blood, and his scarred body was a testament to a life lived in war. But he was also paying the rent for an old woman who'd lost her home and didn't know who to thank, running a free tutoring center for children who couldn't afford one, waiving grocery bills for a mother too sick to work, sending oxygen tanks to a woman named Mrs. Kim whose name didn't appear on any of the criminal ledgers. The world had taught Jane that people were either good or bad, heroes or villains, light or dark. Ryeo Man-Young was making her unlearn that lesson in real time, and the unlearning hurt almost as much as losing her apartment because it meant the world was more complicated than she'd wanted it to be. She left the office, closed the door all the way this time, and didn't mention what she'd seen. 3 days later, Ryeo did something unexpected. He took her outside. "You can't stay locked in this building forever," he said, standing by the elevator in a charcoal overcoat that fell to mid-thigh, his hair pushed back, his jaw clean-shaven, looking like the cover of a magazine that only sold danger and occasionally cologne. "You need air. You need sunlight. You need to remember that you're still alive, and the world still exists beyond these windows." Jane looked at him. "Is it safe?" "No," he said honestly, "but I'll be with you, and that's as safe as it gets in this city." They walked through the old neighborhood, his territory. Doc Sue followed half a block behind with 2 enforcers, one on the same sidewalk, 2 more shadowing from a parallel street visible only if you knew to look, which Jane didn't. But Ryeo pointed them out casually, like a tour guide identifying landmarks. Jane noticed everything, the way shop owners bowed their heads as Ryeo passed, not cringing, not groveling, but acknowledging. Respect, not terror. A fruit vendor held out a bag of tangerines and waved away payment. A barber stepped out of his shop to nod. The way mothers pulled their children a little closer, not away from Ryeo, but closer to themselves. The way you hold something precious when someone powerful walks by. Not fear, awareness. The way a teenager on a bicycle stopped at the corner, handed Ryeo a brown paper bag from a bakery, with both hands a gesture of respect. Jane recognized from her time photographing cultural events in the neighborhood and said, "Grandmother says thank you, sir. She says the apartment is warm and the medicine is helping," before pedaling away without waiting for a response. Ryeo opened the bag. 2 sweet red bean pastries, still warm, wrapped in wax paper. He offered one to Jane without ceremony, just extended his hand, the tattooed knuckles holding the pastry like it was the most natural thing in the world. She took it. Their fingers brushed. Neither acknowledged it, but neither pulled away quickly either. They were standing at a crosswalk 2 blocks from the bakery, Jane finishing the pastry and licking red bean from her thumb, Ryeo scanning the street with the automatic, tireless vigilance of a man who'd survived more attempts on his life than he could count when the black SUV appeared. It came from the east, moving too fast for the residential street. Windows rolled down despite the chill in the air, engine roaring like an animal with somewhere terrible to be. Ryeo saw it before the first shot cracked the air. His body moved on. Instinct honed by decades of violence, he grabbed Jane by the waist with one arm, lifted her off her feet, and threw both of them behind a concrete planter so hard that his shoulder cracked against the stone, and pain detonated through his side like a flashbang. Bullets tore through the space where they'd been standing half a second earlier, shattering the bakery's display window, punching holes in a parked sedan, ricocheting off a fire hydrant with a sound like a bell being struck by a hammer, scattering pedestrians who screamed and ran and dove behind anything solid. Jane screamed. One scream, sharp, involuntary, ripped from her throat by pure animal terror. Ryeo didn't. He rolled on top of her, pinning her flat against the wet sidewalk, his body a shield between her and the bullets, every inch of him covering every inch of her. His left hand pressed her head down. His right hand was already reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband, a compact black pistol that appeared in his grip like it had always been there, waiting. He rose just enough to clear the top of the planter, fired twice, controlled, precise. The shots spaced exactly 1 second apart, and the SUV's rear window exploded inward. Tires screamed against wet asphalt. The vehicle fishtailed, clipped a mailbox hard enough to send it spinning into the gutter, and vanished around a corner, trailing the sound of its own destruction. Silence. Then car alarms, 3 of them, overlapping, creating a dissonant chorus. Then screaming from the shop owner who'd taken cover behind his register and was now realizing that his entire front window was gone. Ryeo was still on top of her. His breathing was controlled, too controlled. Mechanical, like a machine recalibrating after an overload. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, fast but steady, a drummer keeping time in a burning building. He looked down at her face, rain and sweat mixing on his brow, a cut on his cheekbone from a piece of flying glass drawing a thin line of blood toward his jaw, and for one unguarded second, his expression cracked. Not anger, not coldness, not the lethal calculation she'd come to recognize as his default. Fear. Real, human, unprocessed fear. Not for himself, she was certain of that. He'd taken bullets before. The scars on his body were proof. He knew how to be shot at. He didn't know how to watch someone he cared about be shot at. That was new, and it terrified him. "Are you hurt?" His voice was raw, stripped of authority, just a man asking a question whose answer mattered more than anything. "No." She was shaking, every muscle in her body vibrating like a tuning fork. "No, I'm okay." He pulled her to her feet so fast the world blurred concrete, sky, neon, blood all spinning until his hand found hers and anchored everything. His grip was iron. He didn't let go. His men closed rank around them within seconds, Doc-Soo arriving from the same block with his weapon drawn, the 2 parallel street enforcers converging from opposite corners, forming a human barricade with their eyes scanning rooftops, windows, parked cars, every shadow that could hide a second attack. "Get her to the car, now." In the back of the Mercedes, speeding through rain-slicked streets with 2 escort vehicles flanking them like fighter jets in formation, Ryeo went silent for a long time. The city blurred past the tinted windows. Jane watched his temples pulse, his fingers flexing and releasing against his knee in a rhythm that matched something only he could hear. His hand was still holding hers. She wasn't sure either of them had noticed. "Only 6 people knew we'd be walking that route today," he finally said. His voice was different now, colder than she'd ever heard it, colder than the night he'd found her on the curb, colder than the concrete she'd been sitting on. This was a voice that had moved past anger into something more dangerous certainty. 6 people. My inner circle. No one else. Doc-Soo met his eyes in the rearview mirror. The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. 6 people knew. The shooters found them anyway. Which meant someone inside Ryeo Man-Young's own organization. Someone who ate at his table, took his money, swore loyalty to his face, had sold him out. Had sold her out. Had drawn a target on both of their backs, and handed the coordinates to Marcus Thorne. Ryeo pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he looked at Jane, still gripping his hand, her curls plastered to her face, his borrowed black t-shirt now dirty and torn at the shoulder, her eyes wide with a terror that was evolving in real time into something harder, something sharper, something with edges. She wasn't just afraid anymore. She was angry. And anger, Ryeo knew, was the first step toward becoming dangerous. She didn't look away from him. She held his gaze like an anchor holds a ship steady, deep, refusing to let the current win. He dialed. "Park," he said, his voice a blade wrapped in silk. "I need the communication logs for every lieutenant in the inner circle. Every call, every text message, every encrypted chat. Every financial transaction for the past 30 days, and I need the GPS data from every vehicle assigned to senior personnel." A pause on the other end. Park asking why. "Because one of them just tried to kill me. And when I find out who..." He paused, looked at Jane one more time. Her hand tightened around his, and he let it, and something in his expression shifted from cold fury to something worse. Resolve. "I'm going to make the rain look gentle compared to what falls on their head." He hung up. The convoy disappeared into the city's throat, swallowed by streets that parted for Ryeo Man-Young the way water parts for a blade. And Jane Foster, the woman who'd been crying on a curb 5 days ago with nothing but a wet sweater and a broken heart, realized something that changed her forever. She wasn't afraid of Ryeo Man-Young. She wasn't afraid of his tattoos, his empire, his violence, or the dragon inked across his back. She was afraid of what the world would look like without him in it. She was afraid of a city where no one stopped in the rain. She was afraid of going back to a life where powerful men destroyed everything she had, and no one, not the police, not the courts, not a single soul on a crowded street did a thing about it. Ryeo Man-Young was a monster, but he was her monster now. And God help anyone who tried to take him from her. If you're hooked on Ryeo and Jane's impossible love story, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next chapter is going to be insane. Comment below Team Ryeo, the monster who shields the broken, or Team Jane, the girl who stopped crying and started fighting back. Don't miss what happens next. Their bond is about to face its deadliest test yet. Let's dive in. Park cracked the laptop in 46 hours. He'd brought in a specialist, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man from Busan who went by the name Ghost, and who charged more per hour than most surgeons. Ghost didn't ask questions. He didn't make small talk. He sat in the briefing room beneath the penthouse with 3 monitors, a custom-built decryption rig, and a 2-liter bottle of cold black coffee, and he worked in silence for 2 straight days, while Ryeo's lieutenants rotated guard shifts around him like he was a nuclear reactor that needed constant supervision. When the encryption finally broke, Ghost leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette despite the no-smoking policy that everyone except Ryeo respected, and said 4 words. "You need to see this." Park called Ryeo. Ryeo came down alone. The laptop's contents were organized into folders. Jane's photography portfolio, her financial records, personal documents, and one folder she'd labeled simply, River. Inside River were 412 photographs, each one a nail in Marcus Thorne's coffin, industrial drums with hazard symbols, trucks with visible license plates belonging to Thorne Development Group's private fleet, workers in company-branded jackets hauling barrels toward a riverbank already stained with chemical runoff that turned the water a color water should never be. Close-ups of the barrels' labels industrial solvents, heavy metals, compounds that even Ryeo, who was not a chemist, recognized as the kind of poison that gave entire neighborhoods cancer and turned playgrounds into Superfund sites. But that wasn't what made Ryeo's blood turn cold. Ghost had found a second encrypted partition on the hard drive one Jane didn't know existed. Thorne's people had used her laptop to store files before seizing it, apparently confident that no one would ever recover the machine. Inside this hidden partition were financial records, wire transfers, detailed payment schedules running back 18 months, all routed through the same offshore shells Park had traced Thorne's real estate holdings through. And the payments were going to someone Ryeo knew. Lieutenant Shin Jae-won. Ryeo stared at the name on the screen. The briefing room was silent, except for the hum of Ghost's monitors and the distant sound of rain that had started again outside, as if the city itself was weeping for what was about to happen. Shin Jae-won, his third in command. The man who controlled the Syndicate's entire northern territory, 6 blocks of clubs, gambling dens, and protection rackets that generated more revenue than any other sector. The man who'd sat at Ryeo's table for 7 years, who'd toasted his health at every New Year gathering, who'd once taken a bullet meant for Ryeo during a turf dispute with a rival gang from Seoul. That bullet had grazed Shin's shoulder and left a scar he showed off like a Medal of Honor at every opportunity. And for the past 18 months, Shin had been taking Thorne's money, funneling intelligence, positioning his own loyalists within Ryeo's infrastructure, building, piece by quiet piece, the architecture of a coup. The wire transfers told the story with the cold precision of numbers that didn't know how to lie. Monthly payments of $40,000, increasing to $75,000 6 months ago, right around the time Thorne bought Jane's building and started his eviction campaign. The money trail connected to shell accounts that Shin controlled, Accounts Park hadn't flagged because Shin had been using Thorne's offshore infrastructure to hide them rather than the Syndicate's own financial channels. It was clever, parasitic, like a vine growing inside a wall, invisible until the wall crumbled. But there was more. Buried in the hidden partition were communications, encrypted messages between Shin and Thorne, routed through burner emails that Ghost unraveled like thread from a sweater. The messages outlined a timeline. Shin was supposed to eliminate Ryeo within 90 days. Thorne would provide the Muscle, a private security firm operating out of Southeast Asia with military-grade operators who specialized in the kind of violence that didn't leave witnesses. In exchange, Shin would take over the Syndicate and forgive Thorne's debt, give him unrestricted access to operate in the territory, and look the other way while Thorne turned the neighborhood into a dumping ground for whatever toxic waste his development projects generated. Ryeo read every message. Twice. His face didn't change. His breathing didn't change. His hands, resting on the steel table, didn't tremble. But Doksu, who had known Ryeo since they were boys eating stolen rice behind a fish market in Incheon, saw something shift behind his boss's eyes, a door closing. The last door, the one that separated the man Ryeo, might have been from the man Ryeo was about to become. How many of his people are inside our operations? Ryo's voice was flat, mechanical, a machine querying its own damage report. Park pulled up a cross-reference he'd been building since the drive-by. At least 12 confirmed, possibly as many as 20. They're embedded in the Northern Sector crews, the dockside logistics team, and, he hesitated, and 2 in your personal security rotation. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes. Not absence of sound, presence of pressure. Building, compressing, waiting to rupture. Names, Ryeo said. Park read them. Ryeo listened. He committed each name to memory with the same focus a surgeon uses to memorize the location of every artery before making the first cut. Does Shin know we have the laptop? He knows we retrieved it. He doesn't know we've decrypted the hidden partition. As far as he's aware, we only recovered Jane's photographs. Good. Ryeo straightened up. For the first time since entering the briefing room, something that wasn't ice moved across his face. It wasn't warmth. It was precision. The look of a chess player who has just seen the board 12 moves ahead and realized he's already won, he just needs to execute. Tonight. We move tonight. All of it. Every operation Shin controls, every asset he's touched, every crew member who's turned. I want it dismantled before sunrise. Doksu stepped forward. All at once? That's non-negotiable. Ryeo turned to face his remaining loyal lieutenants Doksu, Park, Kwan, and 2 junior officers whose names hadn't appeared on any of Shin's communications. 6 men he could trust in a city of millions. It would have to be enough. Shin thinks I'm distracted. He thinks the drive-by rattled me. He thinks I'm playing defense. A pause. The ghost of something that might have been a smile if smiles could cut glass. Let him think that for 6 more hours. Then we burn his house down. The first order, before anything else, was the most dangerous. The 2 moles in Ryo's personal security rotation. They were dealt with before sunset quietly, personally, by Doksu himself. He visited each man at his home, showed them the wire transfer receipts with their names on them, and gave them 60 seconds to choose, vanish or be vanished. Both chose the former. One wept. Doksu didn't care. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, Ryo's inner perimeter was clean. The broader operation began at 11 p.m. on a Thursday that the Northern District would talk about for years. Ryeo divided his loyal forces into 4 strike teams, each assigned a primary target and a secondary objective. He ran the operation from the back of his Mercedes, parked in a loading dock 6 blocks from Shin's main gambling den, with 3 phones, a tablet showing real-time GPS feeds of his teams, and Doksu behind the wheel keeping the engine running. Team 1 hit Shin's flagship gambling operation first, a 3-story building disguised as a karaoke lounge in the heart of the Northern Territory. Kwan led this one personally because Kwan didn't believe in delegation when violence was on the menu. 12 of Ryo's most trusted enforcers breached the building through 3 entrances simultaneously at exactly 11:07 p.m. The gamblers, civilians, mostly, who didn't know or care whose protection money kept the lights on, were escorted out through the back with surprising politeness. Kwan even held the door for an elderly man who was trying to carry his winnings in both hands. Then they emptied the safes. Every machine was disabled. Every ledger was confiscated. The building's security system was wiped, and its servers were physically removed and loaded into a van that disappeared into the city like a ghost swallowing evidence. Kwan called in the result at 11:23 p.m. Clean. No casualties. Shin's manager tried to call out. We jammed the signal. He's zip-tied in the office. Leave him there, Ryeo said. He'll deliver our message when someone finds him. Team 2 struck the dockside logistics operation at 11:15 p.m. This was Shin's supply line, the network of warehouses and shipping contacts that moved everything from counterfeit electronics to untaxed liquor through the port. Park led this team because Park understood logistics the way poets understand language. He didn't need to break doors. He froze accounts, redirected shipments, changed access codes on warehouse security systems remotely while sipping tea from a thermos in the passenger seat of an unmarked sedan. By midnight, every container scheduled to move through Shin's network was either rerouted to Ryeo's control or flagged for customs inspection, a death sentence for contraband that Shin couldn't undo without revealing his entire supply chain to the authorities. Team 3 targeted the money. Ghost, who had earned his fee 10 times over by now, worked alongside Park's financial team to drain 6 accounts connected to Shin's shadow operations. The money didn't disappear, it was redistributed. Ryeo was precise about this. He didn't steal from traders for profit. He redirected the funds to cover the medical bills of the 3 men hospitalized during Thorne's retaliatory ambush, to the community center's operating budget for the next 2 years, and to a trust account he'd quietly established for Mrs. Cho's grandson's education. Even in war, Ryeo kept his books clean. Team 4 handled the remaining human element. The 12 confirmed moles embedded in Ryo's broader organization were visited individually between 11:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. Each visit was brief. 2 of Ryo's men would arrive at the mole's home or post, present evidence of their betrayal photographs, wire transfer receipts, intercepted communications, and offer a choice. Leave the city by dawn with nothing but what they could carry, or stay and face Ryo's personal attention. Every single one chose to leave. By 3 a.m., Shin Jae-won's empire within Ryo's empire had been surgically removed like a tumor. His gambling operations were dark. His supply lines were severed. His money was gone. His loyalists were scattering across the city like rats abandoning a ship they'd just realized was already underwater. And Shin himself, who had been dining at an expensive restaurant in the central district while his world collapsed blissfully unaware, checking his phone between courses, finding no messages because every channel he relied on had been compromised or shut down, finally received a single text from a number he didn't recognize. It contained one word in Korean: checkmate. Then his phone died, remotely bricked by Ghost, who was already packing his equipment and asking Park for a ride to the airport. Shin tried his backup phone. Dead. He tried the restaurant's landline. The number he dialed his emergency contact within the Syndicate had been disconnected. He stood in the middle of a Michelin-starred dining room, surrounded by couples drinking wine and businessmen closing deals, and for the first time in 7 years, he understood what it felt like to be completely, irrevocably alone. He ran. Ryeo led him. For now, a cornered rat was dangerous. A running rat told you exactly where its hole was, and Shin was running straight toward the only ally he had left, Marcus Thorne. What Ryeo didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted even with his meticulous planning, was that Thorne had been watching too. Thorne had contacts of his own, and when reports of Ryo's coordinated strikes began filtering through the underworld's informal channels, Thorne didn't panic. He adapted. Because Marcus Thorne hadn't survived 20 years in corrupt real estate by being stupid. He'd survived by being opportunistic. And he saw in Ryo's offensive exactly what he needed: a distraction. If Ryeo was on the east side dismantling Shin's operations, then Ryeo was not at the penthouse. And Jane Foster, the woman with the photographs, the evidence, the one loose thread that could unravel everything Thorne had built, was alone. Thorne made one phone call. It lasted 43 seconds. The hit squad arrived at the high-rise at 3:47 a.m. 4 men, not local muscle, not Shin's leftovers. These were the private military operators from Southeast Asia that Shin's communications had referenced, the ones Thorne had been holding in reserve for the coup. Hard men with short haircuts and no tattoos, wearing black tactical gear under civilian jackets, carrying suppressed weapons, and moving with the fluid coordination of soldiers who had cleared buildings in actual war zones. They neutralized the lobby guard with a chokehold that left him unconscious but alive professionalism, not mercy. The building's security system had already been compromised by one of Shin's moles, who hadn't yet received his visit from Team 4, a gap in the operation that Ryeo would agonize over later. They bypassed the elevator's biometric lock with a cloned thumbprint, another gift from the mole, and ascended to the 42nd floor in silence. The penthouse was dark except for the ambient glow of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Rain hammered the glass in sheets, turning the skyline into an impressionist painting of smeared light and shadow. Jane was asleep on the sectional sofa, the charcoal blanket pulled up to her shoulders, her curls dark against the gray cushion. She'd fallen asleep watching the city, her phone still in her hand, a half-finished text to her mother glowing on the screen. "I'm okay, Mom. I promise. I'll explain everything when." She never finished the sentence. The sound that woke her wasn't loud. It was the absence of sound, the sudden, pressurized silence that fills a room when a door opens that shouldn't be open and air moves in a direction it wasn't moving before. Jane's eyes snapped open. She didn't move. Some instinct deeper than thought told her to stay still, to listen, to become as small and invisible as the darkness would allow. Footsteps, soft, multiple, moving through the foyer with the deliberate pace of men who had rehearsed this approach. Jane's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she was afraid they'd hear it. She rolled off the sofa onto the floor slowly, silently, pulling the blanket with her, and crawled behind the kitchen island. The marble was cold against her palms. Her breathing was ragged, and she clamped her hand over her mouth to muffle it. A flashlight beam swept across the living room, then another, crossing in the dark like searchlights over a prison yard. She reached for her phone. Her fingers were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the screen. She dialed Ryeo. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been holding the phone, like some part of him had known. "Jane." His voice was alert, razor sharp, not a man who'd been sleeping. "Someone's in the penthouse," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath. "Multiple. They have guns. Ryeo, they're—" A crash. The living room light exploded on someone had found the switch. She heard a voice bark a command in a language she didn't recognize, and then the methodical sound of rooms being cleared. Doors opening. Closets being checked. They were looking for her. "Kitchen island," she breathed into the phone. "I'm behind the kitchen island." She heard Ryeo say something to Doksu, a single word, guttural, explosive, and then the sound of a car engine roaring to life, tires screaming against wet concrete. "Listen to me." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the fault lines running through it, cracks in the steel where fear was leaking through. "Stay low. Stay silent. Do not move from that position. I am 11 minutes away. Do you understand me? 11 minutes. Ryeo. 11 minutes, Jane. Stay alive for 11 minutes. The line didn't go dead. He kept the call connected. She could hear the engine through the phone, revving, shifting, the wail of speed pushing through rain-slicked streets. She pressed the phone against her chest and made herself as small as physics would allow. 7 minutes in, they found her. A flashlight beam hit the marble countertop above her head. She heard boots on hardwood, rounding the island's corner. She looked up into the face of a man with dead eyes and a suppressed pistol pointed at her forehead. He said something into his earpiece, confirming the target. Jane didn't scream. She was beyond screaming. She was in the place past fear, the place where the body stops trembling and the mind goes diamond hard and clear because there is no room for anything except the brutal mathematics of survival. The front door of the penthouse exploded inward. Not opened, exploded. The deadbolt ripped through the frame like a tooth being torn from a jaw, and Ryeo Man-Young came through the gap like something from a mythology older than civilization soaked in rain. Bleeding from a cut above his left eye, where he'd smashed through a stairwell door rather than wait for the elevator. A gun in each hand, his face wearing an expression that wasn't human. It was beyond rage. Beyond calculation. It was the face of a man who had found the one thing in the world worth dying for and discovered someone trying to take it. He fired before his second foot crossed the threshold. The first shot took the operator nearest the door in the shoulder, spinning him into the wall. The second shot shattered the living room window a miss, deliberate or not, that sent a cascade of rain and wind howling into the penthouse like the storm had been waiting for an invitation. The operators reacted with trained precision, two of them diving behind furniture, the third returning fire from the hallway in controlled bursts that punched holes in the wall inches from Ryo's head. The fourth, the one who'd found Jane, turned his weapon from her to Ryeo. Jane moved. She didn't think. Thinking was too slow for what was happening. Her body simply acted a reflex born not from training but from something more primal, more ancient, the absolute refusal to watch the only person who had ever stopped for her die in front of her eyes. She grabbed the crystal tumbler from the counter above her, the same one Ryeo had poured water from on her first night, and hurled it at the operator's face with every ounce of force her terrified body could generate. The tumbler hit his temple. It didn't knock him out, but it staggered him. Bought 1 second. 1 second was enough. Ryo's shot caught the man in the vest center mass. A hit that would have been lethal without body armor, but instead sent him crashing backward into the refrigerator hard enough to dent the stainless steel. The operator's gun clattered across the hardwood floor, spinning under the kitchen island, stopping inches from Jane's knee. She picked it up. Her hands were shaking. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, dense, warm from the man's grip, smelling of oil and something acrid. She'd never held a gun in her life. She didn't know how to check the safety. She didn't know how many rounds were left. She knew nothing except that Ryeo was pinned behind a marble pillar, taking fire from 2 directions and bleeding from his left side where a round had grazed his ribs, and that the operator she'd hit with the tumbler was getting back up, reaching for a backup weapon strapped to his thigh. "Ryeo!" She slid the gun across the floor. It spun over the hardwood like a hockey puck on ice, crossing the 5 feet between them in a heartbeat. He caught it without looking, his left hand snatching it from the floor mid-slide, while his right hand kept firing, and now he had 2 weapons again, and the mathematics of the room shifted like a scale tipping. He came out from behind the pillar firing both guns, not wild, not desperate, controlled bursts that walked across the room like a metronome, counting down the operator's remaining seconds. The one behind the sofa took a round through the cushion that found his thigh. The one in the hallway caught a bullet in the knee that dropped him to the floor screaming. The one Jane had staggered never got his backup weapon clear of the holster. Ryeo crossed the room in 3 strides and drove the butt of the pistol into the man's jaw so hard he crumpled against the dented refrigerator and didn't move again. The last operator, the one Ryeo had shoulder shot at the door, was crawling toward the shattered window, leaving a blood trail on the hardwood like a red brushstroke on canvas. Ryeo walked to him, stood over him, and placed 1 foot on the man's wounded shoulder. The operator groaned. "Who sent you?" Ryo's voice was barely audible over the rain pouring through the broken window. Calm, conversational. The voice of a man asking about the weather while standing in a charnel house. The operator said nothing. Ryeo pressed down with his foot. The operator screamed. "I'll ask 1 more time. After that, I stop asking and start assuming." The answer came in fragments gasped between waves of pain. Thorne. Thorne sent them. The order was to eliminate the woman and recover any copies of the photographs. They were supposed to be in and out in 4 minutes. Nobody told them the building's owner was a psychopath who'd drive through the city at 140 kilometers per hour in a monsoon to get back in time. Ryeo removed his foot, stepped back, looked at the 4 men bleeding on his penthouse floor, his beautiful, minimal, weapon-like penthouse that now looked like a war zone. Glass and rain and blood turning the hardwood into an abstract painting of violence, and then he looked at Jane. She was still behind the kitchen island, still on the floor. Her hands were braced against the marble, her chest heaving, her eyes enormous. The oversized black t-shirt she slept in was soaked with rain blowing through the shattered window. Her curls were wild. Her face was pale beneath her dark skin, a shade he'd never seen on her before, the color of shock metabolizing into something else. She wasn't crying. She was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen directed at him in his entire life. Not fear, not gratitude, not the wide-eyed awe of someone rescued by a savior. It was recognition. The look of someone seeing another person clearly for the first time, all of them. Every ugly, beautiful, broken, lethal, tender thing, and choosing not to look away. "You came back," she said. Her voice was steady, cracked at the edges, yes. Shaking underneath, yes. But steady on the surface, like a bridge that's taken damage and is still standing through pure structural defiance. "I will always come back." He said it like a fact, like gravity, like something that didn't require belief because it would exist regardless. He crossed the room to her. Glass crunched under his shoes. Rain soaked them both. He reached down and pulled her to her feet, and this time, when she stood, she didn't tremble. She stood straight. She looked him in the eye, and she didn't let go of his hand. His left side was bleeding, a dark stain spreading across his black shirt where the bullet had grazed his ribs. She saw it. Her free hand moved to the wound without permission from her brain, pressing against the fabric, feeling the heat of his blood against her palm. "You're hurt. I've been hurt worse. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true." She almost laughed. Almost. The sound got halfway out before it turned into something else. A ragged exhale that carried the weight of everything that had happened since a man with a black umbrella stepped out of a Mercedes and changed the trajectory of her entire life. Doc Sue arrived 3 minutes later with a medical team and a cleanup crew. The operators were zip-tied, stabilized by the medics, and removed to one of Ryo's secure locations alive, because dead foreign operators attracted the kind of international attention that was bad for business. They would be interrogated, stripped of intelligence, and quietly deported through channels Ryeo maintained for exactly these situations. The penthouse was secured. Ryo's wound was stitched by a doctor who didn't ask questions and didn't make eye contact because he'd learned years ago that Ryeo Man-Young's medical appointments were not the place for bedside manner. Jane sat beside him while the doctor worked. She held his hand, the tattooed one, the one with the dragon's tail coiling across the knuckles. She traced the ink with her thumb while the needle pulled thread through his skin, and neither of them spoke, because some silences say more than language ever could. The endgame came 48 hours later. Fast, brutal, and final the way Ryeo preferred. Shin Jae-won, who had run straight to Thorne's private residence after his world collapsed, was collected by Kwan's enforcement team from a panic room in Thorne's basement. The panic room's manufacturer had advertised it as impenetrable. Kwan penetrated it in 11 minutes with a hydraulic pry bar and the kind of patience that only deeply unpleasant men possess. Shin offered no resistance. He looked 10 years older than he had a week ago, gray-faced, hollow-eyed, the scar on his shoulder from the bullet he'd once taken for Ryeo visible through his torn shirt collar like an accusation. Ryeo dealt with Shin personally. Not with violence, or at least, not only with violence. He sat across from his former lieutenant in the concrete briefing room, the same steel table between them, and laid out every piece of evidence, the wire transfers, the encrypted messages, the timeline of the coup, the names of every mole, the 4 operators who bled on his penthouse floor. He did it calmly, methodically, the way a prosecutor presents a case to a jury that has already reached its verdict. Then he asked one question. Was any of it real? The loyalty, the 7 years, the bullet you took. Was any of it real? Or was I just a stepping stone you were waiting to walk over? Shin didn't answer. His silence was its own confession. Ryeo stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. What happened to Shin after that was handled by Doc Sue, and Doc Sue never discussed the details. Some stories end behind closed doors, and this was one of them. Marcus Thorne's ending was more public. The photographs from Jane's laptop, the barrels, the trucks, the toxic runoff poisoning the river were delivered anonymously to 3 investigative journalists, 2 environmental agencies, and a federal prosecutor's office. Simultaneously, Park forwarded Thorne's financial records, the ones from the hidden partition, documenting illegal payments, bribery, and the funding of criminal operations to the same federal prosecutor, wrapped in a bow of forensic accounting that made the case airtight. Thorne was arrested at 7 a.m, in his bathrobe, on his front lawn, in front of 4 news cameras that had been tipped off about the timing. The footage, a disheveled real estate mogul being led to a federal SUV while sprinklers watered his manicured hedge behind him, played on every local news channel for 3 days straight. His assets were frozen. His properties were seized. His development company collapsed within a month, its contracts voided. Its investors fleeing like passengers from a sinking cruise ship that they'd always known was taking on water, but had chosen to ignore because the drinks were free. Jane watched the arrest on the penthouse television, the new television, installed to replace the one that had been destroyed during the shootout, along with the new windows, the new floors, and a new refrigerator that didn't have a human-shaped dent in the front. She stood at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee, wearing her own clothes now recovered from the garbage bags, washed, pressed, hanging in a closet that Ryeo had cleared for her without being asked. Beside her, Gerald the plant sat in a new ceramic pot, a gift from Doc Sue of all people, who had presented it with the stiff formality of a man, deeply uncomfortable with acts of kindness, and the gruff explanation that the old pot was cracked and it was bothering me. She watched Thorne's face on the hour, screen the confusion, the indignation, the dawning understanding that his empire was over and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not the cathartic rush of justice served that movies promised. Just stillness, the quiet after a storm. The strange peace of standing in a place where you almost died and realizing that you're still here, and the person who tried to erase you is the one who's been erased instead. Ryeo stood beside her, not watching the television, watching her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, turned it over, held it up to the light. "Like I'm done crying," she said. He nodded. That was enough. That afternoon, she finally called her mother. They talked for 2 hours, Jane sitting on the sectional sofa with her knees pulled to her chest, her voice cycling between laughter and tears, and long stretches of silence while her mother processed a story that sounded like fiction and felt like a war. Her mother asked if she was safe. Jane looked at Ryeo, who was standing at the kitchen island pretending to read something on his tablet and absolutely listening to every word. "Yeah, Mom," she said. "I'm safe." In the weeks that followed, Ryeo Man-Young did something that his syndicate had never seen before. He restructured. Not the organizational chart, though, that changed too, with loyal men promoted to fill the gaps left by Shin's purged network. He restructured the purpose. The gambling operations in the Northern Territory were not reopened. In their place, Ryeo funded a job training center and a legal aid clinic staffed by lawyers who owed him favors they'd never be able to fully repay. The protection rackets that had squeezed small businesses for decades were converted into actual security services, legitimate contracts, reasonable rates, transparent terms. The laundering operations were scaled back, their proceeds redirected into a community development fund that Park managed with the same obsessive precision he'd once applied to hiding money and now applied to investing it. It wasn't redemption. Ryeo didn't believe in redemption. He'd done too much, gone too far, shed too much blood to pretend that good deeds could balance a ledger written in red. But it was a choice. A daily, deliberate, eyes-open choice to use the power he'd built to shield the people he'd once only controlled. The neighborhood noticed. Slowly, then all at once. The bakery grandmother, Mrs. Cho's friend, started leaving 4 pastries in the bag instead of 2. The fruit vendor stopped looking at the ground when Ryeo passed and started looking at his face. Children who used to cross the street when his convoy approached began waving from the sidewalk, small hands flapping like birds. And Ryeo, the man who had once leveled an entire block's worth of competing operations in a single night, waved back. It wasn't transformation. It was evolution. The dragon on his back didn't disappear. The scars didn't fade. The tattoos on his hands still told stories of violence that kept him awake on nights when the rain sounded too much like gunfire. But the hands that wore those tattoos now built things, instead of only breaking them. And the man who wore those scars now stood in the gap between the powerful and the powerless. Not as a savior, because saviors were temporary, but as a wall, permanent, immovable, covered in ink and broken in 100 places but still standing. Jane opened her photography studio 4 months after the night in the rain. A small space on the ground floor of a building Ryeo owned rent-free, though she argued about this fiercely and often. And he let her argue because he liked the fire in her voice when she was defending her independence. The studio was bright and warm and filled with her work portraits of the neighborhood, its people, its corners and cracks and contradictions. The old woman from the 3rd floor, the teenager on the bicycle, the fruit vendor, the barber. Faces that told stories no headline ever would. The gallery interview she'd missed the week of her eviction didn't matter anymore. She'd built something better than an assistant curatorship. She'd built her own walls, filled them with her own vision, and answered to no one. She photographed Ryeo once, just once. He sat in the studio's only chair, natural light from the east-facing window falling across his face the way it used to fall across her old apartment, golden, honest, unforgiving. She told him not to smile. He gave her a look that said, "When have I ever?" And she laughed. And the shutter clicked at exactly that moment, catching him looking at her with an expression that was neither cold, nor guarded, nor calculated. It was the only photograph she never displayed. She kept it in a drawer in the studio desk, face down, because some things are too honest for walls. On the day the studio opened, Ryeo stood outside on the sidewalk while Jane cut a ribbon that Doc Sue had purchased from a party supply store with visible embarrassment. The neighborhood gathered not summoned, not coerced, but drawn by curiosity and something warmer than curiosity. Mrs. Cho was there, leaning on her grandson's arm, wearing a new coat that she told everyone came from a church charity and that everyone knew came from somewhere else entirely. The bakery grandmother brought pastries. The fruit vendor brought tangerines. Children ran between adult legs, chasing each other with the reckless joy of people too young to understand the weight of the ground they were standing on. Jane cut the ribbon. The small crowd clapped. She turned to find Ryeo standing slightly apart from the group, not because he was excluded, but because he was giving her the spotlight the way he'd once given her the umbrella, fully, without reservation, without needing to be in the frame. She walked to him. The crowd watched the same neighborhood that had gone silent the night a Syndicate boss stepped out of his Mercedes to shield a crying stranger. They watched her cross the sidewalk in her own clothes, her own shoes, her hair a crown of dark curls no longer glistening with rain but catching sunlight instead. They watched her stop in front of the most dangerous man in the city and look up at him with an expression that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with choice. She wasn't sitting on a curb anymore. She wasn't looking up at him from the gutter, soaked and broken, hoping for rescue. She was standing, level, equal, a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unburned but unbroken, and she had walked through it beside him, not behind him. "Thank you," she said. Simply. No tears, no trembling, just 2 words that carried the weight of everything they'd survived. Ryeo looked at her. The man who didn't smile, who didn't soften, who ruled through silence and precision and the kind of fear that bent cities looked at Jane Foster, and something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not cinematically, just a slight easing around his eyes, a fraction of warmth in the set of his mouth, the smallest, most human thing. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "I know, that's why I'm giving it." He held her gaze. The neighborhood held its breath again. The same breath they'd held that night in the rain when the monster knelt beside the broken girl and the world stopped making sense. But it made sense now. Standing there, in sunlight instead of storm, with a studio full of photographs behind her and a man full of scars beside her, it all made sense. Not in the clean, simple way the world had taught her to expect. Not good versus bad, light versus dark, hero versus villain. Messier than that, harder than that, truer than that. Ryeo Man-Young was not a good man. He would never be a good man. The ledgers and the blood and the dragon on his back made sure of that. But he was her man, the one who stopped when nobody else did, the one who held an umbrella over her head and let the rain soak him instead, the one who came back, who always came back, who'd driven 140 kilometers per hour through a monsoon, because 11 minutes was too long to leave her alone. And Jane Foster was no longer a girl crying on a curb. She was the woman who'd thrown a crystal glass at a killer's head, slid a gun across a blood-slicked floor, and stood up in the aftermath with steady hands and dry eyes. She was the woman who'd looked into the heart of a monster and found something worth protecting not despite the darkness, but within it. She took his hand, the tattooed one, the one with the dragon's tail. He let her. And the neighborhood, the same neighborhood that had learned to look away when Ryeo Man-Young's convoy rolled through, watched. And this time, they didn't look away because they were afraid. They looked because, for the first time, there was something worth seeing. Can Ryeo Man-Young protect the one person who cracked his iron heart, or will the empire he built become the very thing that destroys her? And what dark secret is still hiding on that laptop that even Ghost hasn't found yet? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you do not want to miss what happens next. This story is about to get even more dangerous. Drop a comment, do you think Ryeo and Jane's bond can survive when the streets demand blood and loyalty means choosing between love and power? Like this video if you're obsessed with this forbidden connection between a crying girl on a curb and the monster who decided she was worth a war. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for what Marcus Thorne set in motion from behind bars. See you in the next one. If Ryeo survives, what's coming?